my name is Sarah Bisbing. I am an assistant professor of forest ecosystem science at the University of Nevada, Reno. The work I'm going to be presenting on today is a collaboration across multiple universities, including with Dr. Brian Buma of University of Colorado, Denver, my former master's student, Matt Terzis from Cal Poly, and Don Canestro, who was the former reserve manager through the UC Santa Barbara system. And what I'm going to present on today is the influence of water stress on the potential for type conversion in coastal California endemic pine. The context of the stage I'm going to set is more related to climate change induced drought. We're all familiar with the climate projections at large for North America and further west. And California in particular is expected to see some pretty dramatic droughts and changes in precipitation and moisture. So what you're looking at here is just the cumulative drought severity indices from a 25-year period in the past and a 6-year period in the near future. And you can just see in these visuals that there's been a pretty dramatic increase in the drought severity index across the entire state, but particularly across these mountainous and forested regions. And you can see the progression in particular in this bottom figure of going from 2012 to 2017 was when we experienced one of the most severe droughts in California history and the most severe on record. In particular, what I'm going to be talking about today in the context and the stage I'm setting is talking about tree mortality. And those of you working in forest ecosystems in California are very familiar with this map. It comes from the tree mortality viewer through CAL FIRE. The map on the left shows the cumulative mortality between 2014 and 2018, which was when we really started to see the effects of the drought across the landscape. Those burgundy colors are 40 plus trees per acre that are dead, which is a relatively high number. The yellow is more background mortality. So mortality you would expect in a forest functioning under more natural conditions and in the absence of this catastrophic disturbance. The figure on the bottom right, this chart just shows the accumulation of the total number of trees. And by 2018, the recorded number of dead trees was 148 million across all of these lands in the state of California. This tree mortality progression really started in 2014, as I mentioned, but what you can see in this map, also from the tree mortality viewer, is that it was primarily background mortality. You do see a few scattered patches that are at higher numbers. And what I really want to focus on is how this has changed over time and where we started to see these the first insight into some of this mortality. And so I'm joking here that these are canary trees, like canaries in a coal mine. But really where we started to see mortality are in these more sensitive landscapes where endemic species are confined to very specific climatic and environmental conditions. And any sort of shift in those climatic conditions can lead to higher mortality. What you're looking at here on the right is just a zoomed in onto a few pixels outside of Cambria, California. So between Big Sur on the north and Santa Barbara on the south. And what you're looking at here is in 2014, this is one of the few patches where we actually started to see extensive mortality of a forested landscape. And this red blob on the bottom here is the actual landscape and the ecosystem that I'll be focusing on for the remainder of this talk. For this talk, what I'm focusing on is the distribution and the response of Pinus radiata, Monterey pine. And what you're looking at in this background map is the distribution of two of our coastal endemic conifers. So the orange represents Pinus radiata, or Monterey pine, those 3 orange dots. It also occurs in 2 islands off the coast of Baja, Mexico, Cedros and Guadalupe Islands. In addition, this yellow distribution is Pinus muricata, bishop pine. It's a close relative of Monterey pine. And based on paleo records and past research, we hypothesize that the majority of this coastline was dominated by these sister species 10,000 plus years ago. What we're looking at in the top right is the distribution of Monterey pine that's planted across the globe. So although it's endemic to only 5 tiny populations along the coast of California and Baja, Mexico. It is the #1 timber species globally, and is planted all over New Zealand, Australia, South America, and South Africa in particular. And in New Zealand and Australia, it is their dominant timber species. So despite its restriction to a specific set of sites in California and Baja, Mexico, it can occur and grow well when moved outside of those limiting ranges. In addition to Pinus radiata, in this forest ecosystem I'm focusing on today, Quercus agrifolia, or coastal live oak, is a co-occurring species. Quercus agrifolia is considered a drought-tolerant species, and it is widely distributed across the coast of California. In this research, we utilized a long-term permanent plot network that was sampled from 2002 until this year, 2020, to address a series of questions related to the influence of climate and extreme drought or disturbance on success and response of the species. So our first question was really asking about forest population dynamics and whether they're driven more by exogenous or climatic factors or more by endogenous factors such as forest stand density or impacts of insects and disease. Our second question was specifically looking at how climate influences patterns of mortality and regeneration. So trying to look at the demography or the response of these species to drought. And then our third was to try to get at what we can do, what we can anticipate, and how we can manage for the species under future climatic conditions. These endemic species are particularly sensitive given their narrow distributions and the potential catastrophic influence of mortality on their future success. So I'm going to dive right into some of the climatic data and our results. And I'm happy in the open question section to talk about our models and what we've actually done here. But what you're looking at is the climatic record over the course of the study data I'm presenting. And you can see mean annual temperature in general was relatively stable. It peaked a little bit during that drought. Where we really started to see the impacts was in precipitation and the interactions between these two on climatic water stress. So this middle figure is total precipitation in millimeters on the y-axis, and again, years on the x-axis. And you can see right before and right during the start of the drought, we see a dramatic decrease in total precipitation, coupled with this slight increase in temperature. The bottom figure I've included relative humidity just because we don't have any good fog data. And so we've looked at this as a surrogate for fog inputs to this coastal pine forest. Relative humidity in general was relatively stable over the course of this study period. What we did to try to actually get at climatic stress and the influence of this interaction between water and temperature on these trees was to calculate climatic water deficit over the study period. What you're looking at here is on the y-axis, we have CWD in millimeters. On the x-axis, we have represented each month. And you can see across this that the greatest period of stress for these species occurs during this spring to summer month when this region doesn't receive any precipitation other than from fog inputs. The three main lines to focus on here are the orange, this red, and this pink. Those are the last 3 years of this drought that we sampled, and they are dramatically higher than sort of the range of conditions we saw prior to this and what we would expect on average for this system. So some variability clearly historically, but not as extreme in magnitude as we saw in these last few drought years. What we did is we included this as part of a model to look at the drivers of mortality and regeneration. And I mentioned we use these exogenous and endogenous factors. These exogenous factors, we were looking at previous year's rain, fog, which we used relative humidity and some other surrogates for that, and then climatic water deficit. And then the endogenous factors looking at tree density and the probability of pitch canker infection, which is a non-native pathogen that has pretty dramatically impacted at least top kill and some stress on this coastal endemic pine. For regeneration response, we added cone production and then looked at some of these same climatic variables. Diving directly into the mortality that we saw, so this is for Pinus radiata, and I will also present Quercus agrifolia. What you're looking at here are z-scores, so how we saw deviation from what we would expect on average across different tree size classes for Pinus radiata. So each of these dotted colors represents a different transect, so a different sampling site. And then any dots that are above this zero line represent an increase, more mortality than we would expect on average, and anything below is less than we would expect on average. Notably, of course, in the bottom right, seedlings are sort of all over the place, and we expect that, right? Seedlings are experiencing density-dependent mortality as they grow up into those next size classes, and so we wouldn't necessarily expect that size class to be an indicator of drought impacts. We do, however, see in those other three size classes dramatic increases across almost every transect during this drought period, particularly in this mature tree size class and this sapling size class. When we switch over to Quercus agrifolia or coast live oak, we see negligible mortality. And what I will tell you about this mature tree mortality departure is that that dot in 2015 represents one individual tree. So over the course of the study, with the exception of seedlings, we saw 5 total coast live oak die across this landscape in comparison to thousands of Monterey pine. Diving right into our model results. So I use zero inflated negative binomial models because we had quite a few zeros in our data set across years where we had no mortality or no regeneration. And I use those models with those climatic and endogenous variables I described before to make predictions about what was driving mortality across each size class. Cumulative climatic water deficit, so across a given year, was the best predictor of mortality in mature sapling and small size classes. The previous year's climatic water deficit was also influential in impacting mature trees, but there seems to be some threshold here that interacts with the current year's climatic water deficit. Sapling mortality was additionally influenced by pitch canker incidence. So we see an increase in sapling mortality with an increase in the total number of trees that have pitch canker on that landscape. And then finally, in the bottom right-hand corner, as we would expect, we see increases in seedling mortality with increases in forest density. So that density-dependent mortality occurring there. Across all size classes, we do see this decline in mortality when we see increases in the previous year's precipitation. So that prior year's precipitation seems to moderate or mitigate some of these effects. And there's this line around 480 millimeters of precipitation at which we start to see that reduction in that dramatic reduction in mortality, shifting to an increase in mortality as we see reductions in precipitation. Moving on to regeneration. So on the left side, I have Pinus radiata. On the right, I have Quercus agrifolia. Pinus radiata regeneration was primarily influenced by the previous year's rain. So increasing regeneration with increasing precipitation from the previous year, and then increases in regeneration with increasing seed sources. So what we would anticipate for pine regeneration on the landscape. For coast live oak regeneration, we see the same. Previous year's rain leads to increases in regeneration. And then we also see the current year's rain has an influence. So it requires multiple years of precipitation inputs to be successful. So what does this mean given these results and given that climatic water deficit, so that water stress plus total precipitation are the greatest influences? Well, it's concerning given what the predictions are for the future. So what we're looking at here are 3 figures of mean annual precipitation, frost-free period, which is a surrogate for growing season, and then these extreme heat days. So this threshold, this dotted line, represents sort of that threshold I described on the previous figures. And what we see in terms of climate is that this annual precipitation is expected to continue to drop in this region pretty dramatically to 2080. So we'll go well below the minimum requirements of these species. Simultaneously, we also expect a linear increase in the number of frost-free days, so growing season going all the way out to almost a complete year. And then increases in these extreme heat days across this landscape, upwards of 200 days a year by 2080, which is pretty extreme. So ultimately, our main conclusion is that with the pretty catastrophic mortality we've seen across all size classes of Pinus radiata, plus its limitations to water and its endemic status, and its inability to survive these drought periods, it's very likely that the system will shift more towards this drought-adapted coastline oak that can tolerate these extreme conditions. Over 5 years of drought, only saw a few individuals die in the landscape and was still able to regenerate under that time frame and under those extreme conditions. So Cambria, we joke that it will potentially be called Oaks by the Sea. Cambria itself is currently called Cambria Pines by the Sea. The community leverages this beautiful endemic forest and species as part of its culture and part of the way it presents itself. But what we're seeing is this dominance of oak across the landscape. Some main takeaways before I move in just to the management implications, but our forest population is driven more by exogenous or endogenous factors in general, with the exception of the seedling size class. We saw that it was climatic or exogenous factors. We also identified these species-specific thresholds in climate and precipitation. And then finally, what we can expect is some population declines and compositional shifts across this endemic forest type. Where there is a bright spot, and what I want to think about in terms of management application is, this is from Connie Millar and Nate Stevenson's paper in 2015, is that there are ways for us to ease these transitions. If we stop resisting transitions and work to maintain species and forests on the landscape and reframe our feelings and our thoughts on forests and woodlands, we can actually ease these transitions. So this figure on the top represents a status quo. We have this Monterey pine forest, for example. It starts to experience mortality. We see loss of the species altogether, and then we see a dramatic type conversion, but it takes some serious time to get there because we've lost the seed source and we haven't promoted the species that could survive. Conversely, what Millar and Stevenson promote, and what I will also promote, is this oak woodland serves a variety of purposes and ecosystem services. And if we can assist this ecosystem in transitioning to this more drought tolerant species, there's the potential for us to retain these services and the things that we really value in this ecosystem. I'll conclude there, and I just want to thank my sponsors in this project. So the project was funded by CAL FIRE, the California Fire Safe Council, and the UC Santa Barbara Reserve System. We partnered with the Friends of Fiscalini Ranch Preserve, which is a local nonprofit, the Nature Conservancy, and then the sampling itself was done while I was faculty member at Cal Poly. I'll be at that session on Friday the 16th to answer questions and discuss the research. Otherwise, my email and both of my websites, my professional website and my silviculture experiment website are both listed here if you'd like to reach out with any questions or comments or thoughts. Thank you.